Wayne Swan, nice to have you back on Insiders.
It's great to be here again.
And congratulations on your election.
Thank you.
Look, Labor finished the week with senior frontbenchers assuring Australian businesses that 99.6% of them would pay less tax or the same tax under Labor as the Coalition. Were you surprised to end up on a Unity company tax ticket with the Coalition by the end of the week?
Well, we are nowhere near a Unity ticket with the Coalition. I mean, they are setting out to destroy progressive taxation, both in the company tax system and in the personal income tax system. And the big beneficiaries of the Coalition's company tax cuts are still large multinationals and, of course...
But that hasn't been legislated yet. So at this stage,
17 billion
you're kind of offering the same thing.
Well, no, we're not, because if you look at what the Coalition is doing in the long term, both in terms of company tax, huge cuts to foreign multinationals and to the big banks, but also look at what's going on in the personal income tax system. Down the track, if they get their way, someone on $40,000 will be paying the same marginal rate as someone on $200,000.
We'll get to personal income tax in a second. I do want to talk to you about that. But in terms of the events of this week, on Tuesday, Bill Shorten came out and said that Labor would be removing company tax cuts from companies north of a $10 million turnover. A lot of people in the caucus seem to be taken by surprise by that and were a bit horrified at the prospect of rolling back those tax cuts. Were you among them?
Well, no, I wasn't, because I was aware of what the leadership had been discussing. The key economic committee of cabinet had settled on that. He made an honest error in making that announcement. But when the announcement...
What was the error?
Well, he announced it before it went to the full cabinet. That was the only error. I mean...
Was that just inadvertent?
It was inadvertent, absolutely it was. Following that, there was a discussion, and I think the leadership and the shadow cabinet decided to go to the 50 million threshold, and that puts into that bracket medium-sized companies. But absolutely, where the bulk of these tax cuts go is to foreign multinationals and the big banks.
Do you reckon if it hadn't been for that inadvertent slip, that the ERC and shadow cabinet could have prosecuted that 10 million cut-off through the caucus?
Well, I'm not going to look back and rewrite history.
But, I mean, you would have been comfortable with it.
Well, I was comfortable with that. I'm more than comfortable with our current position, because the focus is on where the big inequity is, which is these massive cuts to large companies who have no obligation to invest that in this country, and they will certainly not be investing it in jobs and growth, as the government claims. The experience overseas with company tax cuts is it's all going to share buybacks and executive salaries. It's not going to the workers.
It's sort of the events of the week highlighted like a bit of an interesting divide in caucus. I mean, there were some people pushing for a $2 million cut-off and some pushing for a $50 million. And so the $10 million seemed like a bit of a compromise. There's seems to be a divide between people who think that, like Anthony Albanese, it's better to be nicer to business and to be more courteous to business. Which camp are you in?
Well, it's not anti-business to oppose the Coalition's business tax cuts, because what they do is they drive inequality in our economy. That is bad for living standards, bad for economic growth, and it poisons society. And at the end of the day, it gives a lot of money to very powerful vested interest in our economy, and that crowds out our democracy.
On Friday, you gave a speech to the New South Wales Labor Conference saying it was time to tear down the neoliberal system and declaring enemies number one as the Murdoch press, the Business Council, large multinationals and vested interests.
Well, the whole of the business community is not supporting what you call the neoliberal agenda, and I call the trickle-down agenda, which is just tax cuts for the wealthy and large corporations and wage suppression for the rest, because that's bad for economic growth. What it actually leads to is wealth concentration.
So I gather from the tone of your rhetoric that you're not in the Albanese...
Rhetoric, it's good economics, actually.
Your language is not really in accordance with the Anthony Albanese model of being more courteous to business. Did you disagree with that speech that he gave?
Look, I've got plenty of friends like Anthony has in the business community, and there are voices in the business community that are not heard. There are people out there who openly acknowledge that the economics of our current situation with low income growth for working people is we have to look at what's going on with wages, and we also have to invest in the drivers of growth, in the health and education of our people. And that is a respectable economic argument, and it is one that will drive growth, and it's therefore pro-business, not anti-business.
What did you make of the Albanese speech in general?
Look, I thought it was a pretty standard speech. I mean, I read all of the speeches of our front bench. I take a deep interest in what they do. I thought it was unexceptional, to be frank.
Obviously, there's some discussion about his motivations. He said this week that he's always supported every Labor leader. Is that your recollection?
Look, I'm not going to go through all of the ballots, but I mean, the one thing that I do want to do as party president, because I've been through the good times and I've been through the bad times, is to make sure we put the past behind us. The stunning success of this opposition over 5 years is to put forward a courageous program of reform with an unparalleled degree of unity and consensus. And that's what's going to take us to the election. We went within a whisker of winning last time. We can win next time. We have to have the unity, the discipline and the policy.
Has Bill Shorten earned the right to lead the next election?
He has been spectacularly successful. As you know, being the opposition leader is just the toughest gig in politics. He has done extraordinarily well as opposition leader, and he deserves the opportunity to get out there and take government at the next election.
Got some dicey by-elections coming up. You saw that polling in Longman that makes it look difficult for Labor. A, do you think that Labor can win that by-election? And B, do you think it's a reflection on Bill Shorten if they don't? Well,
I know Longman well. We've held it for, 5 years out of 22 years. It's a tough seat. So, you know, the decision of One Nation to preference the Liberals makes it even more difficult because we only won the seat on One Nation preferences in the last election. Look, it's doable, but it is extraordinarily difficult. It's a very difficult seat for us, but we're going to give it our best shot. Wayne Swan, as newly elected Labor president, you're the custodian of the rules, and one of those rules is the one that Kevin Rudd installed that makes it quite difficult for a caucus to remove a leader. You've made it pretty clear that you endorse Bill Shorten very heartily, but how functional is that rule in practice? I reckon it's been really successful. I think it's been the foundation of the unity that we've seen over the past 5 years. Look, it gives the rank and file a say in our leadership, but it still gives a really strong voice to our caucus, because a strong voice for MPs is important because we're in a system of representative democracy. So I think as a compromise, it's pretty good, and I think it's worked very well for the Labor Party. So you wouldn't like to see the caucus kind of working around or repealing or marching back that rule in any way? Well, I'm very much in favour of the current rule. All right. Now, we said we'd get back to income tax, and now's the time. Now, you're a former treasurer with an experience of watching economic circumstances turn against you in office. What's your opinion of the decision of the legislative body to install a 7-year program of tax cuts? I think they're putting an economic time bomb in the system. It's the old right-wing ratchet. What they do is they give big tax cuts over time, and then in a few years' time, they turn around and say, oh, we can't afford to fund health and education. It's a way of shrinking the state and driving greater wealth concentration in modern advanced economies. That is precisely what has happened in the United States. We cannot go down that American road. In 2007, when you were campaigning as Shadow Treasurer at the time with Kevin Rudd, who was the leader of the ALP, you were faced with an announcement of $34 billion in tax cuts by Mr Howard and Mr Costello. You decided to nearly replicate those cuts, and then economic circumstances changed. Down the track, did you regret making that decision? Well, I think that at the time the tax cuts actually worked reasonably well, but we took the unfairness out of those tax cuts at the end, at the top end. But we're in favour of. But they built in a kind of a structural deficit that you struggled with. Well, we did, but we struggled more with the impact of the global financial crisis on revenue, which tanked revenue for a decade. But those tax cuts were then used to stimulate the economy at the time, along with the other measures that we took. But the fact is that we are in favour of reward for work. If people are working a bit of overtime to get a bit more money in their hand, we're always in favour of giving working people a fair go in the wage system and in the tax system. What we're not in favour of is this largesse at the top in the company system and the personal income tax system. So I get the feeling that as Labor president, which has usually been a kind of a statutory role, you're going to be more of an activist president by the sound of it. Is that your intention? Yeah, well, when I announced I wasn't running for Parliament, I was getting out of Parliament, I said I wasn't getting out of politics. I mean, I love this country and I want to see it remain a country where there's a fair go where when we create prosperity, we spread opportunity. And I can see that slipping away, particularly through the aggressive trickle-down policies that we're getting from the Conservatives who have taken over the Liberal Party. And that's going to keep me motivated, and I'm going to be very active on it.
OK, well, let's look at a couple of the things you've floated in recent speeches. Late last year, you said that the government should consider raising company taxes case by case for companies who pay their executives too much.
Well, we certainly need to do something about executive pay. I mean, if you look at what's going on, where basically the top end of town and those on the highest incomes are basically gorging themselves. I mean, look at the revelations in the Banking Royal Commission. Essentially, what drove all of that bad behaviour, unethical behaviour, was the reward and incentive systems in the pay structure. So executive pay, for example, in Australia now, is back to the levels it reached prior to the global financial crisis. So we need to see some of our corporate rules change, which ensure that executive pay is brought under control. That's very important because the example it sets to the rest of the workforce is shocking.
Sure, but seriously, a bespoke company tax rate individually for big companies that are overpaying?
I was just saying there's things that can be done.
Right, but you propose that as a thing.
Well, it should be done by the boards.
OK.
So I think that's right. But if we don't do that, there might be other things we could do.
You're talking about company tax. That's a government decision, not a board decision. Do you think that companies that overpay their execs should have a higher rate of tax?
Well, if they don't do something about it, we've got to have all those options on the table because it is ripping our society apart, this sort of inequality.
You've also advocated the installation of workers and union representatives on corporate boards across Australia and the Reserve Bank board.
That's right.
That would need to be enforced by legislation?
Yeah, some of it would, absolutely.
Well, why didn't you were Treasurer for 6 years and you didn't appoint anyone from the unions?
Well, I've learned from my period as Treasurer.
Right,
and one of the lessons I learned is that if you suppress the voice of Labor, and if you get to a point we've now got to, that there's a shrinking share of GDP going to working people, that's bad for the economy. We've got to reinforce the voice of Labor, not just through trade unions, but trade unions are an important part of that. Our society, particularly at its upper level, suffers from a blindness of affluence. Too many people and business leaders in our community don't mix with working people. We need to hear the voices of working people on the ABC board, on the Reserve Bank board. And yes, I do regret I didn't put a worker on the Reserve Bank board.
Are people entitled to be a bit sceptical that your Bernie Swanders' new incarnation is not the same Wayne Swan that campaigned as an economic conservative and cut welfare to single parents? Well, your running mate did.
He did, but if you go back to my first speech in the Parliament in 1993, I talked about trickle-down economics and the impacts it was having in America. And, you know, we're back there now, and it's far worse.
As Treasurer, you didn't increase Newstart. You took benefits off working single parents. I mean,
we took a massive series of steps to make this country much fairer. I could take you through them. The increase in the age pension, the tripling of the tax-free threshold, all of the steps we took in the global financial crisis to keep